Hello, I'm Lynn Doyle. Thank you for joining us for Meet the Doctors, where each week we look at important health news, medical breakthroughs, and alternative therapies and how they may impact you and your family. We don't take the latest studies on face value. We explore the facts so that you can make educated decisions. In fact, we want to empower you to take charge of your own well-being. Today, we'll be joined by medical entrepreneur and internist Joseph Gulfo, who'll be talking about his new book, Innovation Breakdown. It's his disturbing account on how the FDA and Wall Street cripple medical advances. We'll also have a leading authority on Alzheimer's. Neurologist Richard Lipton, who is head of the Division of Cognitive Aging and Dementia at Montefiore Hospital, will give us his latest information on treatment and how close we are to a cure for this devastating disease. And then later, our panel of doctors will be here to answer your email questions. But first, the news. A top-secret experimental serum may have saved the lives of 2 American aid workers who were infected with the deadly virus while working with stricken patients in Liberia in Western Africa. Dr. Kent Brantley was seen wearing a protective isolation suit as he walked on his own from an ambulance into Emory University Hospital in Atlanta. He'll continue treatment there under a quarantine. Fellow aid worker Nancy Wrightball is also being treated there. Meanwhile, the Peace Corps has evacuated hundreds of volunteers in the affected countries. The Ebola virus has killed more than 800 people so far in Africa and could have catastrophic consequences if allowed to spread through that continent, according to World Health officials. Now, the virus destroys the immune system, and so far there's no cure. But the good news is it can only be contracted if you actually come in contact with bodily fluids. CDC officials here insist there is little chance that it will spread to the U.S. Our doctors will address that later in the show. Now, as eerie as it may sound, a group of Caltech researchers have actually created a see-through mouse. Seriously, by removing the lipids in the tissue and replacing them with a transparent gel, they were able to create the first invisible organism. The idea behind creating a transparent mouse is so that scientists could have a clearer way to study organs and tissues when they're in the lab, and then that gives them a window into diagnosing illnesses in human beings. We do want to point out there that this operation is only performed on dead mice. I can just imagine those little invisible mice scampering around the lab, can't you? It would kind of be like that H.G. Wells science fiction novella called The Invisible Man. Remember it? I bet you do.
You're crazy to know who I am, aren't you? All right, I'll show you.
Now, statins, the widely used cholesterol-lowering drugs, may now have a role in healing wounds after surgery. The review of 20 mostly animal and laboratory tissue studies, as well as 2 studies involving humans, demonstrated various ways in which statins can lower inflammation. They also showed how it could promote the growth of blood vessels and reduce the healing time. Here's good news for the 26 million Americans affected by type 2 diabetes, which accounts for 90% of diabetics. The FDA has approved a new drug called Jardiance, which can be used alone or can be added to existing regimens to control blood sugar levels. That's in the overall management of the type 2 diabetes. It also recommended the drug be used along with eating a healthy diet and exercising. It was tested in 7 clinical trials with about 4,500 people with type 2 diabetes, and the study showed that Jardiance improved blood sugar levels when compared to a dummy placebo drug. Now, we all drink hot coffee and tea out of them. The cups made of styrene. That's the key chemical component of those foam cups. Well, now an independent panel of scientists has confirmed drinking out of these may actually cause cancer. You've probably used it with food products or with a coffee cup. They're saying now that that's something you should probably not do. People who are heavy smokers or who have smoked over a long period of time are more likely to develop age-related macular degeneration. That's the leading cause of blindness among Americans over 50. AMD is a common eye disease that results in damage to the central part of your retina that's needed for reading and driving and recognizing faces. Smoking might damage blood vessels that nourish that retina, or it could deposit toxins within that retina tissue, and that would cause the damage. Out of 4,500 Participants in the study, 24% actually developed that early stage AMD. That was over 20 years. Another 4.5% progressed to late stage AMD. And finally, a new study of 25,000 older men seems to contradict current claims that testosterone therapy could increase the risk of heart attack or stroke. The study, which was funded by the National Institutes of Health, may actually help a lot of fears about testosterone use. Every year, $1.6 billion are spent on testosterone products with the aim of boosting muscle tone and sex drive for men with so-called low T. And those are our headlines for this week. We'll continue our show here on Meet the Doctors right after this short break. Welcome back to Meet the Doctors. I'm Lynn Doyle. Now, we have a story for you next that is really gripping, so to speak. The fist bump. It appears now to be a better, more sanitary way to greet a friend than the traditional handshake. We're going to go straight to Newsmax Deputy Health Editor Nick Tate, who's telling us this may seem like a little bit of nonsense. Hey, Nick, so if I give you a fist bump, what are you going to do? You going to fist bump back, or are you going to shake my hand?
I'm giving it right back to you. Here's a fist bump to you. It's true that friendly neighbor, that friendly handshake may go the way of the 8-track tape, Lynn. A new study out of Wales has found that a handshake spreads about 20 times more germs than a fist bump, and even a high five passes along about half the amount of germs as a handshake. Now, it's an interesting piece of research that 2 researchers fist bumped and shook hands and high-fived each other dozens of times after one of them dipped his hand into a gloved hand into a broth of bacteria, and then they recorded how many bacteria were transferred with each greeting. Now, what makes the fist bump more sanitary, of course, is that there's less surface contact from shaking of hands, and there's less time. Whether it will actually replace the handshake or not really remains to be seen.
I just can't imagine elected officials out on the campaign trail fist bumping all of the potential voters. I see them shaking hands in the traditional manner, don't you?
They really call it, pressing the flesh for a particular reason. It's more engaging than a fist bump. I have to say, though, it does seem like kind of a frivolous topic, but in fact, secondary infections in hospitals and healthcare settings are really serious. I mean, they kill thousands of Americans every year. So it's possible that adopting the fist bump as opposed to a handshake in hospitals and nursing homes and healthcare settings may in fact be a smart thing to do. The point that I would make, though, is that even with the fist bump, it's not foolproof. So fastidious hand washing is still a very good idea and what we all should be doing more of. In one particular setting, though, there's one place where you shouldn't be squeamish, I guess is the right word, about asking whether the person you're interacting with has washed his or her hands, and that's your doctor, that's a nurse. If you're in a hospital or healthcare setting, before someone examines you, you should always ask the question, have you washed your hands? And more doctors and nurses are going to be accepting that as not only a friendly request, but something that's wise to prevent the spread of disease.
I have to tell you, Nick, I even do that in the nail salon and ask whether or not the woman who's performing the manicure has washed her hands and has sanitized the equipment that she's using.
Well, the bacteria are all around us, and in fact, with the increase of infections from many places far away, international air travel it has brought infections that were once remote to us, to other places in the Western world, and so you really can't be too careful when it comes to being fastidious and making sure that the folks that you're interacting with in either fist bumping or shaking their hands are doing the same.
Okay, good to see you, Nick. And now, on a more serious note, what do you think happens when you have a medical solution that could save thousands of lives, but despite that evidence, the FDA won't approve it and Wall Street makes big bucks because it's rejected? Well, Dr. Joseph Golfo says that nightmare scenario happened to him, and he's now chronicled his decade-long battle with the FDA and Wall Street in a new book called Innovation Breakdown: How the FDA and Wall Street Cripple Medical Advances. And Dr. Golfo joins us now in our New York studios. It's good to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
So instead of shaking your hand, can I give you a fist bump?
Sure.
Good to have you here. You run biotech companies which develop products hopefully to save lives. Ultimately, you want those products approved by the FDA. How challenging is it to get that approval?
The drug development process, and for certain types of devices as well, and biotech products, is extremely difficult. The development process in the preclinical phases and all through the clinical phases, very, very hard. In fact, only 1 in 100 products that make it into the clinic actually get approved.
And how long a process would you say that takes?
10 to 15 years.
15 years?
Yes, 10 to 15
From
years.
the time a company comes up with an idea to the
Yes.
time it could actually bring it to market?
Yes.
Is that because the FDA puts roadblocks up for it, or just because certain testing needs to be established and statistics need to be recorded?
Definitely. The robust development is required. You need to show that you know how the product works. You need to show it's safe in animal models. You need to put it in the clinic and show you've gotten the right dose and that it does what you say it does with respect to the effectiveness or efficacy, and that it's safe. And no one in the drug development world has a problem with that. We need to prove drugs are safe and effective. It's very hard to do. It's also extremely time consuming, as we just talked about, and it's extremely costly. And when you put those three together, that means extremely unlikely. The reason I wrote the book is we've now moved from an extremely unlikely process to a near impossible process, because the FDA, which used to have a healthy skepticism that you had to overcome and you could overcome with data, has moved to basically an anti-innovation agenda, where the only thing that moves FDA beyond the slam dunks, beyond the obvious no-brainers, is media attention or congressional oversight.
When you say anti-innovation, do you think the FDA is deliberately putting up roadblocks as an overabundance of caution, or because they are so afraid that if they approve something and down the road it ends up not to be as effective as it predicted, it could get the blame?
That's exactly, you hit the nail on the head. It's fear. The FDA is afraid. No one ever got fired for saying no. And that's the problem. The FDA, the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act states that the FDA's mission is to promote health. Promote health through the efficient review of safety and effectiveness of new products. But if you go on the FDA website, they've changed that. They say their mission is to protect health. Now, protecting and promoting are two different things. It's like an attitude in baseball. If you're up at the plate and you're a hitter, your attitude is, I'm swinging unless it's a ball. And that's to me, that's promoting health. If you're a guy who's looking to walk, you say, I'm only going to swing if it's a strike. So the FDA doesn't mind walking. They don't mind moving it. Whereas I want to hit a home run.
Well, I was going to ask if that's what you hope to accomplish with writing this book. Are you essentially calling the FDA out? Do you really think that you will change decades of behavior on its part?
Yes, I do. Because when I first started in this industry, data moved the FDA. The FDA worked with companies. I was able to call the FDA and get my reviewer on the phone, discuss problems, discuss this, discuss that, and move things forward. And what I've learned now, my last 2 product approvals, where we hit every endpoint. Endpoint means you write down on a piece of paper exactly what you're going to show in your trial, okay? And I've done 2 in a row where we've hit every endpoint, primary, secondary, whatever, and we still had rejections by FDA that had to be overcome. So I've gone from a healthy skepticism from FDA to an absolute fear. FDA now regulates on a fear-based manner. And by the way, there's 2 reasons driving it. There's an ideology that basically anything new is a potential problem, okay? Versus anything new could be a tremendous breakthrough.
You also talk in the book about Wall Street's role. What is it?
So what Wall Street does is they prey on little companies, because little companies need to raise money. They're the engines of innovation. That's where really breakthrough things happen. So in the natural development process, when things don't always go right, Wall Street has a very short holding period, and then they'll sell, and the stock will go down. It'll be difficult for the company to raise money. Then they prey on the That's the natural vicissitudes. And then when FDA does what it does, Wall Street also does the same thing. And things like dark pool trading, shorting these small biotech company stocks, playing the deal, all these things really hurt innovation because it makes it difficult for companies to raise money.
And yet, are there products out there that the FDA is looking at and potentially approving?
Right, and I wrote this book because of that. It's not just what I've lived. So you have a drug for multiple sclerosis called Lemtrada. It's approved in Europe. It's a great drug. It actually was on the market here for a certain leukemia. The company pulled it to then get it approved for multiple sclerosis. FDA won't approve it. No one understands why. Sunscreens. There's over a dozen sunscreens that have been on the market in Europe for more than 10 years. And we have 1 American an hour dying of melanoma, and FDA is not approving these sunscreens. So there's just so many things that are still happening that we have to challenge and make better.
And you did that in this book, Innovation Breakdown. You're going to stick around and answer some of our viewer questions for us?
I'd love to.
We appreciate that very much. We'll take a short break, and that question and answer session will be coming up when we return. Stay with us. Meet the Doctors continues right after this. Welcome back to Meet the Doctors. I'm Lynn Doyle. You know, Alzheimer's disease affects almost 6 million people in the United States, and so far, there's no cure. Here to tell us about some recent breakthroughs, though, in hunting down a cure for it is Newsmax Deputy Health Editor Nick Tate. You know, Nick, I don't know about you, but this is one of those diseases that just really frightens people, no matter how old you are.
There's no question about that. I mean, it really is the big fear that Alzheimer's will strike you. Losing your ability to think and have memory is really a big problem. And it's also a leading cause of death. According to the CDC, Alzheimer's is the 6th leading cause of death in the U.S. And in fact, many experts believe that it's really underreported and might actually be number 3 on the list behind cancer and heart disease. That's because death certificates often only list the immediate cause of death for Alzheimer's patients. For instance, a death certificate may say pneumonia or respiratory infection when in fact the actual cause may be Alzheimer's that caused that infection. Also, many families, many patients mistakenly view dementia as a normal form of aging, and it just simply is not.
Are there ways that we can predetermine if we're a candidate to get Alzheimer's?
Well, there is a strong genetic component, so if you have Alzheimer's in the family, then you are at risk. There is no cure for it, and so the best thing you can really do if you are at risk is to get early treatment. The drugs that people take can actually slow the progression of the disease and in some ways arrest it from moving forward. But at this point, there is no test to determine if you have Alzheimer's, so you can get on those drugs, and there really is no cure. So the best thing to do is pay very close attention to memory lapses. If you have those senior moments and they're occurring frequently, you really need to talk to your doctor about whether there is something going on that you can get treatment for.
Thanks, Nick, for that update. Joining us now here in New York is Dr. Richard Lipton. He is the head of the Division of Cognitive Aging and Dementia at Montefiore Medical Center and the director of the Einstein Aging Study, which has tracked elderly residents since the 1980s. He recently attended the Alzheimer's Association International Conference in Copenhagen. Dr. Lipton, it's good to have you with us.
Great to be here.
What was the mission of the conference in Copenhagen?
Well, so this is an annual meeting that brings together Alzheimer's scientists from all over the world, and we really get together to talk about the research that we've been doing and to figure out next steps. And increasingly in the Alzheimer's world, large groups of scientists are working together to discover important genes, to identify biomarkers that can help us predict who may get Alzheimer's in the future, and to develop spinal fluid and blood tests for the disorder.
Was that the big takeaway from this year's conference?
Well, there are a number of takeaways. We know that when people develop Alzheimer's disease, 2 abnormal proteins accumulate in the brain. One of them is called amyloid, the other is called tau. For several years now, we've been able to use PET scans to identify amyloid in the brains of older adults at risk for Alzheimer's disease, and that helps predict risk, but it's not perfectly predictive. One of the big pieces of news at this meeting was that it's now possible to take pictures of the brain protein tau, again using PET scanning in living people, and the hope is that that will help us do a much better job in the future of identifying people at high risk for interventions.
You mentioned the future. I was wondering if it would have an impact on people who are suffering from it currently. The research that you're talking about is really for those who might be diagnosed later on.
Well, so amyloid imaging is an FDA-approved diagnostic that's available now. So if someone has memory complaints and they get an amyloid PET scan which shows this abnormal protein in the brain, that is highly predictive of actually having Alzheimer's disease and of experiencing gradual cognitive decline. And many of the treatments we're developing are designed to either keep the brain from making amyloid or to increase the breakdown of amyloid or to actually remove amyloid from the brain, though those treatments are still experimental. The diagnostics actually for amyloid are now reasonably well developed and clinically available.
It sounds like there's a several-prong approach to dealing with Alzheimer's. There's the research for it, and there's the treatment and understanding of it. How have treatments today for patients who are currently suffering from it changed from when you first started your research?
Well, so when I first started studying the disorder, there were really no treatments at all. So the clinical approach was, if you suspected somebody had Alzheimer's disease, you did absolutely everything you could to identify some alternative, more treatable cause like hypothyroidism or depression or vitamin B12 deficiency or vascular disease. Now there are a number of FDA-approved treatments for Alzheimer's disease. 3 of them work by souping up a brain chemical called acetylcholine, which we know is diminished in the Alzheimer brain. And by doing so, we can improve cognitive function, though not really slow the progression of illness. There's another class of drugs that work on a brain chemical called glutamate. You know, the drug Namenda is the example of that class. And then there's still other agents that are in development, but there are a number of FDA-approved drugs that help, but not as much as we want them to, certainly.
And certainly not as quickly as we would like them to. It's, as I said to Nick earlier, probably one of the most frightening diseases for generations of individuals. It used to be when you heard the word cancer that it just made your heart stop. Now, I think for baby boomers, particularly when we hear Alzheimer's, it frightens us terribly.
Well, I think the reason the disorder is so devastating is that it, you know, attacks the very core of what makes us human. You know, what could be worse than losing your memory, losing your past, fearing losing the ability to take care of yourself? So yeah, it is a very frightening illness, I certainly agree.
And of course, when there is something that can be done as a preventative, we all want to take advantage of that. So the stress that we all have in our lives, is there anything that we could do to prevent it from perhaps being a trigger for Alzheimer's?
Yeah, so we actually presented a couple of papers at the Alzheimer's meetings looking at stress as a risk factor. And, you know, so people often say, well, you know, life is stressful, what can you do about stress? But we measure stress at 3 levels. There's, first of all, the circumstances you find yourself in, the traffic jam I was caught in on the way to the studio today that made me late, for example. But then there's the perception of the stressful event, and if people get agitated and ruminate, that makes a stress hormone called cortisol go up, and it also activates the autonomic nervous system. And then there's stress biology. So our work shows that people who have high levels of perceived stress develop dementing disorders at increased rates relative to those who have lower levels of stress.
Another reason to get stress out of our lives. Dr. Lipton, thanks so much. We'll be back with more right after this. Welcome back to Meet the Doctors. I'm Lynn Doyle. You know, each week at this part of the show, we give you the opportunity to ask questions of our panel of doctors. And then we try to give you some information so that you can empower yourself and make really smart medical decisions. We always recommend, though, that before making those decisions, that you do talk to your own personal doctor. Joining us for this week's panel from his Florida office is Dr. Gervasio Lamas. He's a cardiologist who is also a pioneer of chelation therapy. That's for stroke victims that actually reduces the risk of another possible fatal stroke. Joining us once again here in our New York studio is internist Joseph Golfo. Now, normally we ask you to send us your questions, but we have gotten such a lot of volume of mail talking about this Ebola virus. We thought that we would talk about that in general. So let's answer some of the most general questions that you have sent in to us. Dr. Lamas, if I could please begin with you, could you tell us from your perspective just how serious this crisis is in West Africa?
Well, again, not having been to West Africa, I can tell you that that is a very poor part of the world, and it is a crisis that engenders fear, and it engenders not just fear within the area, but fear outside the area. So it increases poverty and isolation.
People have claimed that it could be catastrophic if it spreads across that continent. Is it the kind of virus that literally could wipe out a population?
Look, the kinds of viruses that wipe out a population have certain characteristics. Typically, they're spread either through the air, say like influenza or measles. It's spread, that's respiratory spread. So it goes from person to person quickly. And others are spread in the water supply or in the food, say like cholera. This has neither of those characteristics. The third thing that happens for a virus to spread, say like HIV or AIDS, is that it has to have a long period during which it is contagious before the host dies. So the Ebola virus is not spread through respiratory contact, it is not spread through the water, and the victims are sick only for a short time. So it seems unlikely to me that this is going to really make its way out of Africa into the first world, Western countries, and become a problem there.
Well, I'm sure that that's reassuring to people who are watching the show, but let's talk, Dr. Golfo, about how it is spread further from what Dr. Lamas just talked about. If I'm in the room with someone who has been diagnosed with Ebola, could I catch it?
Not through casual contact. You'd have
No?
you'd have to be exposed to their body fluids, either through breaks in your skin or through membranes. So here in the US, we have universal precautions. And that's been in vogue for about 30 years now. So we do not touch body fluids without gloves on. We do not approach a sick patient without proper protection in the form of mask or goggles. So I couldn't agree more with Dr. Lamas that you just wouldn't see that kind of spread here. And casual contact certainly would not cause spread.
But we are an international community, and I think probably why people at home are a little fearful is because people can be in Africa one day and in New York or LA the next. Can it spread that quickly? Could someone who had it come in contact with us on a plane and maybe shake our hands? We have an open sore, and then all of a sudden it's here on our shores.
Well, it is here, right? We do have 2 people here, a third here in New York. That they actually, excuse me, I think they've ruled that out. But we have 2 people here in the States that were brought here by airplane. So yes, it can come here in that way, but it really does not have a chance of spreading here in the United States as it spread in Western Africa.
We talked, Dr. Lamas, about the conditions there and how they differ from the United States. Is that what you would say to any patient or anyone who is watching, that we have much more sophisticated medical techniques here that would prevent that spread and that we really don't need to be worried?
I really think that there is no room for fear here. We've learned a lot from hepatitis B, hepatitis C, and HIV. And universal precautions in hospitals and in physicians' offices are great. You wear gloves, you wear a mask, and you really don't touch bodily fluids. And it's very different in a very poor country where getting clean gloves may be a real problem. Those are issues that keep the disease spreading locally. Every once in a while, someone will travel to New York or to Miami, where I am, and the important part is having our emergency room personnel trained to recognize that. But even so, even if you show up in the emergency room, no one suspects what you have. Your bodily fluids are going to be handled with tremendous caution.
So if people suddenly develop flu-like symptoms, you're not necessarily recommending that they run to the emergency room suspecting that they have Ebola?
Oh gosh, no. I think
Okay.
that would be, they would certainly regret it 5 hours later in the emergency room while they were waiting.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. We're going to continue our conversation. You'll answer some other questions when we come back, but I do just want to thank you so much for talking about this because it's on everyone's minds right now. So you've given us a lot to think about, but more importantly, you've reassured us. So thank you so much for that. As I said, we will take a quick break, but when we come back, we will answer your questions. We always suggest that if there's something you'd like us to talk about, that you go ahead and email those questions to us, and we'll help you out as much as we can. We're going to take a short break. We'll be right back. Let's continue answering some of our viewer email questions. You know, just a moment ago we were talking about Ebola, and our doctors assure us that at this point there's nothing for us really to be concerned about here in the United States. But that leads us to another question, this one for Dr. Golfo. Says, we know that you are involved in the production of new drugs. Are there any dealing with Ebola virus that are currently in production?
Yeah, we could talk about 4 very quickly. The National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease announced today that they developed a vaccine that's 100% effective in preventing infection in monkeys, and it's about to start clinical studies in September. So that would be a preventative vaccine, good for healthcare workers. A company called MAP Biosciences developed an antibody that can be given to patients who are early in the disease. In fact, 2 of the patients that have now come to the United States received that antibody, and the reports are that they responded well. And that's just 2 patients, but that would neutralize the virus. It's called passive immunotherapy. Then there's 2 other products in development. Techmira has a product that would stop the virus from replicating once it got inside the cell. It's a classic biotech approach, blocking the mRNA replication of it. And then another drug that actually blocks the virus's entry into the cell, a small molecule. So there's 4 things very exciting in development for Ebola that hopefully we'll never have to have this conversation again.
That is good news. Dr. Lamas, we have a question for you, especially since you are a cardiologist. Which is better, weightlifting or cardio exercise? I've always heard that aerobic exercise is important, but I've been reading a lot of stories that the health benefits of building muscle are actually greater. Can you clarify for us?
Sure. As we age, we lose strength, flexibility, and balance. And so, in fact, having a lot of cardio exercise, so you're able to run 5 miles, for example, and not terribly winded, has limited utility. And while it's good to be active and you get benefit from that, there's little increment from doing so much activity. I tend to recommend to my patients as they start getting older that they do exercises like yoga, which is something I practice. And which gives you a lot of those, strength, flexibility, and balance. Just remember those. That's what you want to be recovering or at least not losing as you get older.
Okay, good advice. Get into yoga if you haven't done it so far. I discovered it, and I have to say, it really does make you feel pretty good. Our next question, also for you, Dr. Lamas. I'd like to change my diet to lower my cholesterol. I don't want to have to take a statin unless I have to. Could you recommend things I could include in my diet?
Sure. There are some plant matters like, and they're called plant sterols, and you can find them in health food stores, and there are some margarines that are made with them that will lower your cholesterol to a certain extent. Eating less animal fat will lower it also to a certain extent. But what I think is really important is not to neglect those patients who really do need to take a statin. So if you've had a heart attack, if you are diabetic and have had a heart attack, boy, you really need to keep that cholesterol really low. And you shouldn't be monkeying around with half-hearted measures. Go for the money and go for the drugs that have a track record.
You mentioned foods that we should eat. Are there things that you list to your patients that they should absolutely never let pass their lips?
You know, I tend not to be a forbidding kind of doctor. And what my patients do is not that they eat the wrong kinds of food, it's just that they eat mounds and mounds of food. And so it's really an issue of portion control. It's a difference between having one glass of wine or a case of wine.
And how about our sugars? What can we do to control the amount of sugar that we put into our body and then perhaps ward off things like diabetes?
Well, concentrated sweets are actually fairly toxic in the sense that they increase insulin levels, that drives fat into fat cells. They really do have toxic effects. But to a certain extent, they're very addictive. They stimulate pleasure centers in the brain. And it's very hard once you are used to having that excessive sweetness in your diet to get off it. Unfortunately, willpower is really what you need to lean on, and to cut back on the servings of concentrated sweets. Try to stick with complex carbohydrates such as you find in fruits, and again, reduce the portions that you're eating.
We have a question about coffee and caffeine. What do you normally suggest when it comes to intake of caffeine?
Well, caffeine in coffee and tea, in my opinion, never killed anyone. Now, if you are using caffeine in a pharmacologic way, and that's what I'm talking about, these stimulant drinks that particularly kids take,
Right.
That's a different kettle of fish entirely. That really jazzes you up and revs you up in such a way that the coronary arteries can actually have spasm, or it can promote clotting.
So you're talking about those energy drinks, so to speak.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think so to speak is the operant term here. They are drinks that have tremendous amounts of caffeine and then also disguised stimulants that are derivatives of caffeine in one way or another that might be herbal in nature.
Okay.
So they sound natural, but they really rev you up, and they can have dire consequences on the heart.
Okay, we need to be very careful about that.
Yeah, those are nasty.
Okay, and one last question here before we say goodbye for Dr. Golfo. I've been taking Beniva for about 10 years now, and I can hardly walk straight. What would you suggest I take in lieu of it?
So Beniva works in osteoporosis by blocking the bone. It's called resorption, the breakdown of bone. But there's other things that need to be done as well. You need to promote the buildup of bone. So calcium, vitamin D, exercise, yoga, walking. There are a couple of new drugs. Forteo is a drug that actually builds up bone. Prolia is a drug that stops the breakdown of bone in a different way. So what I would do if I were that patient, I'd go see my doctor and I would talk about all three ways. Drugs that build up, drugs that stop the resorption, and things that, non-drug approaches to build up the bone.
All right, thank you very much. As always, wonderful to see you. Dr. Lamas, wonderful to have you with us as well. We certainly appreciate your time and your expertise.
Thank you, Lynn.
And that is all the time that we have for this edition of Meet the Doctors. We certainly want to thank you for joining us, thank all of our doctors for being here with us, and we'd like to invite you to be happy and healthy. Until the next time, I'm Lynn Doyle from Meet the Doctors.